Thank you, Chairman, and ladies and gentlemen, for this rare opportunity to address the Union in the afternoon. And without a black tie, I regularly have, since 1983 actually, spoken in this chamber in debates, but I'm occupied on Thursday nights with television work and have to turn down the Society every year more than once. So thank you very much for this opportunity at a time that I could make it to address you, and on a subject of great moment, because it's my thesis that the world is at war, that it will continue to be at war, and indeed we may be on the brink of a cataclysmic escalation of that state of war. And I will sketch out, inevitably sketch, rather than fine detail. Perhaps in the Q&A we'll get deeper into the detail, but sketch out what I think we need to do to pull ourselves out of this apparently endless state of war. So who's the war in this era between? I say this era because, unfortunately for me, I'm old enough to have known other eras in which the protagonists were different, profoundly different. I became active in politics when the United States was pulverizing the Asian people of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, causing literally millions of deaths, dropping oceans of chemical weapons on peasant people, destroying their agriculture, their lives, and even the lives of succeeding generations. The people of Vietnam were, of course, overwhelmingly not Muslim, but they were in a state of confrontation with the United States because they insisted upon their right to national independence and unity, free from the diktat of big power politics. I was talking to the chairman before the meeting about probably the last frontier in that confrontation, his own country of Korea. Of course, itself artificially divided by the big powers and kept apart and in a state of confrontation, one part with the other. But in today's era, the war undoubtedly is still between East and West, but this time the war is with the Muslim East. Muslims are not, of course, confined to the East. There will be some sitting here in the room, I'm absolutely sure about that. But the confrontation is between East and West because all the bombs that are dropping in the world today are dropping on the peoples of the East and overwhelmingly upon Muslim peoples. And that would be one thing if the Muslim peoples were prepared to take it on the chin. It would be one thing if the empire did not strike back. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, the empire now has the ability to strike back and the willingness to strike back, not to take it on the chin. And so we have reached a situation where we, an impoverished country, which has to charge you £9,000 a year to come here. I may say in parenthesis, I never attended university, but I did work from the age of 16, and my taxes when I was 16 went not just so that students could study here in Oxford entirely free, but to give them a student grant with which to do so. Now we can't, as a nation, pay our electricity bills. In my own constituency of Bradford, just this day, figures announced show a 540% increase in youth unemployment over the last 4 years. We can't afford to educate our young people. We can't find jobs for our young people. Our public services are being butchered wholesale, and it's only just started. That butchery, 80% of that butchery is still to be seen and felt. We have an absolutely parlous economic situation in our country, yet apparently, no matter how cold our old age pensioners get in the winter time, we still have money to go around the world bombing and setting fire to other people's countries. We can burn pensioners around the world, but we can't keep our own pensioners warm in the winter time. We have mass unemployment, and every index that you can study shows us to be an ever poorer, ever more divided and unequal country. Yet our thirst for joining in imperial wars abroad in this era against Muslim countries is apparently insatiable. And so I want to deal specifically with Britain's role in a minute. But let's sketch the areas of confrontation, the scale of confrontation. And let's take as our apparent starting point 9/11, 2001, when apparently, out of a clear blue sky, hijacked aeroplanes smashed into important, iconic buildings in the United States and cruelly murdered thousands of people. I say apparently out of a clear blue sky because the vast majority of the citizens of the United States and the United Kingdom did imagine that this came out of a clear blue sky. But it's my case that in fact these attacks emerged out of a swamp of hatred and bitterness in the Muslim world about Western policy towards them, Western policy and double standards and endless injustice. On 9/11, 2001, what were the casus belli so far as the Muslims in the world were concerned? The first, which remains true today and has been true for more than half a century, is the injustice meted out to the Palestinian people, whose country was wiped off the face of the earth. You often hear talk about people threatening to wipe countries off the face of the earth. But the only country, in fact, wiped off the face of the earth in the Middle East was the country of Palestine. Go to your atlas and check. Palestine was wiped off the map, its people scattered to the four corners of the earth as stateless, passportless, paperless, hopeless people, living either under brute, illegal military occupation in what they call the West Bank, in occupied Jerusalem, in besieged Gaza, or within what they call Israel. Those who spilled across the borders, living generation now after generation, 3 generations, in rancid, wretched refugee camps in the neighboring Arab countries, living lives of indescribable squalor, without hope, apparently, of ever returning to the homes and the lands from which they were driven by force in 1948 and beyond, but still holding on to literally the keys and the papers, the title deeds of the property from which they were driven. Their children and their children insisting that they come from Haifa or Jaffa or Jerusalem or Ramallah, even though neither they nor even their parents had ever seen these places. So far, so bad. What does that have to do with us, you might say? Well, here's what. This entire tragedy, this entire disaster was authored in the very building in which I have sat for 25 years, in the British Parliament, where on behalf of one people, our Foreign Minister, Mr. Balfour, promised to a second people the land of a third people, unique even by imperialist standards, not least because we as an empire did not even yet possess the land which belonged to other people, which we were offering to a third. And of course, since that fateful declaration, all the blood that has flowed under the bridge in the subsequent almost 100 years has been paid for, sponsored, made possible by Western support for what they call Israel. Israel would not exist if not for imperial decision. It could not exist if not for imperial subvention, particularly in the last decades from the United States of America. Every bullet, every aeroplane, every rocket, every shell fired into a Palestinian refugee camp is paid for by the American taxpayer or by private American philanthropy. Not many people care about that in the West. But in the Muslim world, they care very much indeed. They care because Palestine is sacred to them. It's sacred to them for many reasons, but the most important of which is that the capital of Palestine is Jerusalem. The heart of Jerusalem is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, from which Muslims believe the Prophet Muhammad ascended to the heaven and returned with the revelation. Before Mecca, Muslims prayed towards the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. They cannot stand the fact that foreigners have captured by force this sacred place. They cannot stand the fact that the Palestinians have been subject to these series of disasters, hunted from pillar to post, massacred in one country after another, deprived of their home, deprived of their hope. But they can stand even less the insult that has been added to the considerable injury suffered by the Palestinian people. And that insult is to blame the victim for what has happened to them. In this case, the Palestinians, who are the victims of a gross act of international terrorism, are called the terrorists, and the people responsible for the act of terrorism are called the victims of terrorism. Now, you may not care about any of this, but be sure the Muslims, 1.7 billion of them in the world, care about it very much indeed. And it is a major, the central cause of the existence of that swamp of bitterness and hatred. But it is not the only one. Our support for the brute dictatorships who rule the Muslim world almost without exception, from one end to the other, whose iron heel stands on the neck of most of that 1.7 billion people, are only in power because of the military, financial, political, diplomatic support of Western countries. I could run through them all, but I'll give you only the worst example. Who is our best friend in the Muslim world? With which country are we best friends in the Muslim world? Saudi Arabia, the darkest, most tyrannical regime on the earth, where there is no freedom or liberty of any kind. Women are not even allowed to drive cars or step out on the street without a male relative accompanying them. And yet, this family business, this tyranny, which chops the head off people in public squares on Friday afternoons, live on television, for the discouragement of the others, is our closest and best friend in the Muslim world. What do you think the ordinary people of what they call Saudi Arabia think of us when we go to war here and there for democracy, for liberty, whilst arming to the teeth the most tyrannical regime in the Muslim world? I'll tell you what they think. They think we're not a democracy, but a hypocrisy. This is organized hypocrisy. Fighting for democracy in Syria while supporting the crushing of freedom of any kind in Saudi Arabia. And I could go through, believe me, dozens, scores of Muslim dictatorships to buttress this point. And so, when this medieval, obscurantist, savage, Bin Laden, murdered thousands of people in the United States, the Pavlovian reaction was to find this Mephistopheles in the Tora Bora with his beard and his turban and strike him down, as if that would solve the problem. But if you'll forgive me quoting myself, as I said in the House in the week of 9/11 when it was recalled, if we handle this the wrong way, we will make 10,000 Bin Ladens. And I underestimated. For having handled it in exactly the opposite way to that which we should, we have made not 10,000 Bin Ladens, not hundreds of thousands of Bin Ladens, but millions of Bin Ladens all over the world, including in our own country, including in our own towns and cities, like the ones who incinerated themselves and murdered 55 innocent people on 7/7/2005 here in our own country. What is it that we did that was wrong? We invaded and still occupy in a war which we predicted, we in the anti-war movement predicted would be a disaster. Little did we know how long it would last and how big a disaster it would become. A country, Afghanistan, which no one in history has successfully occupied. Not even Alexander the Great successfully occupied Afghanistan, and David Cameron certainly isn't Alexander the Great. We occupied it, and we killed its people, and every time we killed another family, another wife, another child, another wedding party, another funeral party, we generated more and more hatred and terrorism against us. We said that occupying Afghanistan could only come to the grief to which it has come. If anything, though briefer, though it's worth making this point, our war in Afghanistan has now lasted longer than both the First and the Second World Wars combined, with absolutely no sign of any ending. But it was, Chairman, the war to which you referred and for which I was expelled after 36 years in the Labour Party, holding and serving in every position from the bottom to a 4 times elected Labour Member of Parliament. The invasion and occupation of Iraq, which had nothing whatsoever to do with 9/11. Most of you are too young to remember the mendacity, the militarized mendacity that was deployed in this country and in the United States to persuade us to go to war with Iraq. linking Al-Qaeda and the Iraqi regime, which had not only nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, but was a sworn enemy of Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda with it. The mendacity about weapons of mass destruction. The lie that we had to attack, invade, occupy Iraq to stop it attacking us. And in that disaster, we in the anti-war movement and millions of people in this country, millions, the biggest demonstrations ever held in this country, told the government, even though we did not know then what we know now, that the weapons of mass destruction were a gigantic lie, told to us by our own government, regurgitated by the Bush and Blair Corporation, formerly known as the BBC. We told our government in our millions that this war not only could not be justified, but would lead to ever greater disaster. And who now will gainsay that? Who will step forward and say that any good has come of this disastrous decision, the worst British foreign policy decision since the Boer War more than 100 years ago, and vastly more damaging to our national interests and the safety of our own people? It led to not just the disasters of Abu Ghraib, where the pictures emerged of civilization, us, forcing Iraqi prisoners to strip naked, putting dog leads around their necks, forcing them to lie on top of each other, to commit indecent acts upon each other, and videotaping it for the entertainment of the troops in the barracks afterwards. It didn't just lead to 1 million Iraqis dead. Imagine 1 million Iraqis. How many Iraqis could you fill in this hall? 5,000? 10,000? Imagine 1 million dead Iraqis. Imagine 3 million Iraqis driven out of their country, now living as refugees and exiles in surrounding countries and beyond. It didn't just do these things. It fanaticized and extremized hundreds of millions of Muslims around the world, made them hate us even more than they already had hated us. And millions of those are ready, stand ready to hurt us in retaliation for the hurt that we have visited upon them. And lastly, because I sense you're anxious about the time, we are now on the point of doing all this again, and on exactly the same tower of lies. The lie which says we must attack Iran, even though it's acknowledged that Iran has no weapons of mass destruction, even though we know Israel has hundreds of weapons of mass destruction. We know that because of the brave Jewish whistleblower Mordechai Vanunu, who spent 20 years in solitary confinement for telling us so. His appearances in court, requiring his jaws to be literally wired together so that he could not speak in the court to tell us any more about the hundreds of nuclear weapons possessed by Israel illegally, outside of any treaty, subject to no inspection, and made possible by the very Western largesse about which I have been talking. Imagine that for a double standard. Try giving me a logical explanation for why you would attack a country with no nuclear weapons to defend a country with hundreds of nuclear weapons, when the country with no weapons is a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, does allow regular inspections, and is acknowledged not to have a nuclear weapon. But we must attack it or support the attack upon it by a country illegally holding hundreds of nuclear weapons and occupying other people's land and subjugating other peoples endlessly, decade after decade, with Western support. And now if you cannot see how all of this would fill that swamp of bitterness and hatred, then you shouldn't be at Oxford University. You shouldn't be studying in this jewel in our crown. If you cannot see how all of this, and much more if I had time, has filled this swamp with bitterness and hatred. And so the only way that we can solve this is not by more and more war. That just fills the swamp more and more. Not by investing in more and more MI5 and MI6 men. And good afternoon to you. Not by investing in more special branch officers. Although all of that investment may very well be necessary, could hardly be otherwise. But if you live by the side of a swamp, it doesn't matter how many fly swats you have, you cannot possibly stop all of that which is coming out of that swamp. And so the only answer is to drain that swamp of bitterness and hatred. And that requires an end to our occupation of Muslim countries, an end to our support for the brute dictatorships who rule the Muslim world, and above all, the delivery of justice to the people of Palestine. Thank you very much for listening.